sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected ways. When you've lived 60 years and buried the only woman you ever loved, you learn that silence can be heavier than mountains. Jedediah Holt sent for a mail-order bride from his cabin in Montana Territory. What arrived was a woman with a burlap sack tied over her head and a note that read, "Unfit, no refunds." The townspeople said she was cursed or disfigured. Most men would have sent her back, but Jed took her anyway. When they reached his cabin and she finally removed that sack, what he saw changed everything. It wasn't horror that took his breath away. What could be so terrible that someone would hide it, yet so beautiful it would heal an old man's broken heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine ridges like a widow's veil, and Jedediah Holt stood on his cabin porch watching it rise with the sun. At 60, his hands were gnarled from decades of setting traps and splitting wood, his beard more silver than brown, but his blue eyes still held the clarity of mountain streams. The silence around him was profound, not empty, but full of the kind of peace that only comes to those who've learned to listen to what the wilderness has to say. 10 years. 10 years since Martha had died, trying to bring their first child into this world, taking both their dreams with her into the cold Montana ground. Jed touched the simple gold band on his finger, Martha's wedding ring that he'd worn on a chain around his neck until loneliness had driven him to slip it onto his own hand. Some nights, when the wind howled through the valley, he could almost hear her voice calling him in for supper. His cabin sat in a natural clearing beside Willow Creek, surrounded by towering pines that had stood sentinel long before the first white man set foot in this territory. The structure was solid 2 rooms with a stone fireplace that could heat the whole place, thick log walls chinked tight against winter's bite, and a roof that had weathered 20 seasons without a leak. Martha had loved this place, had stood in this very spot, and declared it perfect for raising a family. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles down the mountain in Pine Ridge, a settlement that barely qualified as a town. Maybe 40 souls on a good day, including the children. There was Barton's General Store, where old Henrik Barton held court behind his spectacles and ledger books. The Silver Dollar Saloon, run by a former cavalry sergeant named Murphy, who could still straighten his back when ladies were present. Doc Henley, who'd patched up more gunshot wounds than he cared to remember, but had gentle hands when it came to delivering babies. And Father McKenna, an Irish priest who'd come west to save souls and stayed to fish the mountain streams. It was Barton who'd suggested the mail-order bride idea, passing Jed a newspaper advertisement one autumn afternoon when the first snows were dusting the peaks. "Man your age shouldn't be spending winters alone," he'd said, not unkindly. "Gets into a fellow's head, all that quiet." Jed had resisted at first. The idea of replacing Martha seemed like betrayal, like admitting their love hadn't been enough to sustain him. But as the days grew shorter and the nights longer, he found himself staring at that advertisement. Respectable women seeking marriage with honest, hard-working men, correspondence welcomed. References required. He'd written 3 letters before finding the courage to send one. His handwriting was careful, practiced from years of keeping trap records and weather observations. He described his cabin, his trade, his quiet life among the mountains. He mentioned Martha only once, saying he'd been widowed and understood the value of companionship. He didn't mention the loneliness that sometimes made him talk to his horse just to hear a voice, even his own. The response had come from a matrimonial agency in Chicago. They specialized, they wrote, in matching frontier men with refined ladies seeking new opportunities in the territories. For a fee of $25, They would arrange all correspondence and transportation. The lady they had in mind was educated, experienced in household management, and eager to begin a new life in the West. Her name was Clara. That was all they'd told him in their efficient business correspondence. Clara, age-appropriate, willing to travel, no family obligations. She would arrive on the Tuesday stage, they assured him. All arrangements had been made. Tuesday had come with an October storm that turned the mountain roads to mud and delayed the stage by 6 hours. Jed had waited at Barton's store, nursing coffee that had grown cold and bitter, watching through the window for any sign of horses and wheels. The other men in town kept glancing at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Getting a mail-order bride at his age seemed to strike them as either admirable or foolish, depending on their own circumstances. When the stage finally rolled into Pine Ridge, mud-splattered and swaying, Jed's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The driver, a weathered man named Corcoran, climbed down from his seat and began unloading bags and parcels. Then he walked to the stage door, opened it, and helped down an elderly woman with a carpet bag. Mrs. Henley, Doc's wife, returning from visiting her sister in Helena. After that came a traveling salesman with sample cases full of tonics and elixirs, followed by 2 cowboys heading south for winter work. Finally, Corcoran reached into the stage one more time and pulled out something that made the gathered townspeople fall silent. A woman, but barely recognizable as such. She wore a simple brown dress, travel-stained and wrinkled, but it was her head that drew every eye. A rough burlap sack had been tied over it with hemp rope, covering her completely from neck to crown. She moved carefully, like someone walking in darkness, her hands extended slightly to feel her way. Corcoran handed her a small cloth bag, only luggage, and pressed a folded paper into her hand. Then he climbed back onto his seat without a word of explanation, as if delivering hooded women was an everyday occurrence. The woman stood alone in the muddy street, her head turning slightly as if trying to orient herself by sound. The townspeople stared in fascination and horror. Someone whispered the word witch. Another voice suggested she was diseased, probably with something contagious. Jed approached slowly, his boots squelching in the mud. "Ma'am, are you Clara?" Her head turned toward his voice, and she nodded once. Her hands shook as she extended the folded paper toward him. Jed unfolded it and read the words that would change everything. Unfit for marriage. Refund impossible. No returns accepted. It was signed with the seal of the matrimonial agency, nothing more. The crowd had grown silent, except for the shuffling of feet and the occasional murmur. Barton stepped forward, his face creased with concern. "Jed, maybe you should." "Ma'am," Jed interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Would you like to come home with me?" She nodded again, more vigorously this time, and he saw her shoulders shake with what might have been relief or fear. He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong, the hand of a woman accustomed to work. They walked through town together, past the staring faces and whispered conversations, past the children who peered around their mothers' skirts, past the old men who shook their heads in disapproval or admiration. At the livery stable, Jed helped her up onto the wagon seat beside him, her movements careful and practiced, despite the sack that blinded her. The ride to his cabin took 2 hours through mountain trails that switch-backed up through stands of pine and aspen. She sat quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her covered head turning occasionally towards sounds of bird call, the splash of water, the creak of wagon wheels. Once, when they crossed a particularly rough patch and she swayed against him, he felt the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of her dress. "Almost there," he said, as they rounded the final bend and his cabin came into view. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded him of Martha's favorite quilt. He helped her down from the wagon and guided her carefully up the porch steps. At the door he paused, suddenly uncertain. What did a man say to a woman he'd never seen, whose face was hidden behind burlap, whose past was a mystery wrapped in cruelty? "This is home," he said finally, opening the door and stepping aside to let her enter first. She walked into his cabin with the careful steps of the blind, her hands extended to avoid furniture. The room was warm from the fire he'd banked that morning, and the smell of pine logs and coffee lingered in the air. She stopped in the center of the room, her covered head turning, as if taking inventory of this new world by sound and scent. "There's a chair by the fire," Jed said softly, "straight ahead about 6 steps. She found it without difficulty and sat down, her hands immediately going to the rope that bound the sack around her neck. But then she stopped, her fingers hesitating at the knots. "Ma'am," Jed said, hanging his hat on its peg by the door, "I don't know what they told you was wrong with you, but I've seen enough of life to know that most folks are just afraid of what they don't understand." Her hands stilled completely. "You're welcome here," he continued, settling into the chair across from her. "Whatever's under that sack, whoever you are, you're welcome here. But you don't have to show me anything until you're ready." For a long moment, the only sounds were the settling of logs in the fireplace and the distant call of an owl, beginning its nightly hunt. Then, slowly, her hands moved to the rope again. The knots were tight, tied by someone who'd wanted to make sure they wouldn't come loose easily. But eventually, they gave way, and the burlap sack fell to the floor with a soft whisper. Jed Holt had lived 60 years, had seen beauty in mountain sunrises and terrible storms, had loved one woman with all his heart and buried her with all his grief. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw when Clara lifted her face to the firelight. She was beautiful, not the fresh beauty of youth, but the refined loveliness of a woman who had lived and learned and carried her experiences with grace. Her hair was auburn, streaked with silver at the temples, and pinned back in a style that spoke of education and refinement. Her skin was pale but smooth, her features delicate but strong. Her eyes were the deep green of forest shadows, and they were filled with tears. But it was what those eyes held that took his breath away, not physical scars, but the deeper wounds of someone who had been told she was unworthy of love. "Lord, have mercy," Jed whispered, and Clara flinched as if expecting condemnation. Instead, what she saw in his weathered face was wonder. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and Clara's quiet weeping. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, as if waiting for judgment that had been passed on her so many times before. Jed leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands gripping his knees. "Ma'am, I don't know what those people told you, but they were wrong. Dead wrong." Clara's green eyes met his for just a moment, before darting away, as if she couldn't bear to see whatever truth might be written in his expression. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice carrying the cultured accent of someone educated back east. "You don't know what I've done." "Then tell me." She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You'll send me away. Everyone does, once they know." Jed rose slowly from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening mountains. The peaks stood like ancient guardians against the star-filled sky, unchanging and patient. "Clara, I've lived in these mountains for 30 years. I've seen bears kill men, and men kill each other over a handful of gold. I've watched the seasons turn and people come and go. And I've learned that most of what folks call unforgivable ain't worth losing sleep over. He turned back to face her, his blue eyes steady and kind. Whatever you've done, whoever you're running from, it doesn't change the fact that you're sitting in my home because someone threw you away like broken crockery. That tells me more about them than it does about you. Clara's composure began to crumble. Her shoulders shook, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold back words that had been trapped inside her for too long. "I was married," she said finally, the words barely audible. "For 15 years, I was married to a man who owned half of Boston's shipping trade." Jed returned to his chair, settling himself to listen without judgment. "Cornelius Blackwood," she continued, the name falling from her lips like a curse. "Rich, respectable, with a house on Beacon Hill and fingers in every profitable venture from the harbor to the State House. When I married him, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. I was 28, already considered an old maid, the daughter of a failed minister with nothing to offer but a good education and decent manners." She touched her throat, where faint marks were visible above the collar of her dressled scars, barely perceptible unless someone knew to look for them. "He was charming at first, generous. He bought me beautiful gowns, took me to the finest restaurants, introduced me to Boston society as his accomplished wife. But accomplishment, I learned, was only valued when it served his purposes. When I expressed opinions, I was corrected. When I showed independence, I was punished." Jed's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. "The punishment started small," Clara went on, her voice growing stronger as the words found their way out. "Harsh words when I disagreed with him in public. Locked doors when I tried to visit friends he disapproved of. Then it became worse, much worse." She pushed up the sleeves of her dress, revealing thin white scars around her wrists, not the kind that came from accidents, but the deliberate marks of restraints. "He would tie me to the bedpost when I displeased him," she said, her voice now steady with the calm that comes after accepting terrible truths. "Not for intimacy, you understand, but for punishment. Sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. He told me it was for my own good, to teach me proper submission." Jed's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "How did you bear it?" "I told myself it was temporary, that if I could just learn to be the wife he wanted, it would stop. I convinced myself that his anger was my fault, that I was difficult and ungrateful and deserved correction." She laughed bitterly. Amazing how a person can believe such lies when they hear them often enough. Clara reached into the small cloth bag that held her few possessions and withdrew a delicate silver locket. With trembling fingers, she opened it to reveal a small photograph, not of a loved one, but of herself from years ago, smiling beside a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. "This was taken on our 5th wedding anniversary," she said, holding the locket so Jed could see. "Look at my smile. Even then, I was pretending everything was perfect." Jed studied the photograph, seeing how the young Clara's smile never reached her eyes, how she seemed to shrink away from the man beside her, even as she posed for the camera. "What changed?" he asked. "My father died last year and left me a small inheritance. $3,000, not much by Cornelius's standards, but it was mine. My father had been very specific in his will that it was to be held in my name alone, not subject to the laws that gave husbands control over their wives' property." She closed the locket with a sharp click. "Cornelius was furious. He'd counted on that money for a business venture that had gone poorly. When I refused to sign it over to him, she paused, touching her throat again. "He tried to force me, but I'd grown stronger over the years, and I fought back. For the first time in 15 years, I fought back." "Good for you," Jed said quietly. "I hurt him," Clara continued. "Not badly, but enough to shock us both. While he was stunned, I grabbed what I could carry and ran. I took my inheritance money and bought passage on the first train heading west. I thought, if I could just get far enough away, I could start over. So you answered my letter? She nodded. The matrimonial agency seemed like a blessing, a chance at a new life with a man who knew nothing about my past. But when I arrived in Chicago to complete the arrangements, Cornelius had already found me. Jed leaned forward. He followed you? Worse. He hired detectives to track me down, and when they found me, he had them spread lies about me to the agency. He told them I was mentally unstable, morally corrupt, a woman who had abandoned her marital duties and stolen money from her own husband. Clara's voice grew bitter. The agency believed him, of course. Why wouldn't they? He had documents, witnesses, legal papers that made me look like a criminal and a madwoman. They said they couldn't, in good conscience, send such a woman to an honest frontier man. But they sent you anyway, Jed observed. They were afraid of what Cornelius might do if they simply cancelled the contract. Bad for business if word got out that they'd been deceived, so they decided to send me with that. That terrible note, hoping you'd reject me immediately and they could wash their hands of the whole affair. Clara looked directly at Jed for the first time since removing the sack. They never expected you to take me in. Most men would have put me right back on the next stage. Jed was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything she'd told him. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, a night wind sighed through the pines, carrying the promise of winter. "Clara," he said finally, "do you still have that inheritance money?" She nodded, patting the small bag beside her chair. "Most of it. I've been careful." "Then you're not a thief. You took what was rightfully yours." "But I left my husband." "You left a man who was hurting you," Jed interrupted firmly. "There's nothing immoral about protecting yourself from harm." Clara stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "You really believe that?" "I believe that any man who would tie up a woman and leave her helpless is no man at all," Jed replied, his voice carrying a hardness that spoke of his own capacity for violence when protecting those he cared about. "I believe that a woman has the right to defend herself, same as any creature in the wild." For the first time since removing the sack, Clara smiled, a tentative, fragile thing, but genuine. "What happens now?" she asked. Jed stood and walked to the mantelpiece, where Martha's photograph sat beside his pipe and tobacco pouch. He touched the frame gently, as if asking permission for what he was about to say. "Now you stay here, if you want to. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different tears of relief rather than despair. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Jed confirmed. "Winter's coming on strong, and these mountains don't forgive folks who aren't prepared. You'll be safe here until spring, and by then," he shrugged, "by then we'll know what comes next." That night, Clara slept in Martha's bed, while Jed made himself comfortable by the fire. As he listened to her quiet breathing from the next room, he found himself thinking about second chances and the strange ways that broken people sometimes found exactly what they needed in each other. The locket lay on the table beside her bed, and in the morning, Jed noticed the photograph inside had been turned face down. The first week passed like a careful dance between two people learning each other's rhythms. Clara woke before dawn each morning, as if years of walking on eggshells had trained her body to rise before trouble could find her. Jed would discover her in the kitchen, already stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil, moving through his space with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making herself useful. "You don't have to do that," he told her the third morning, finding her mending a tear in one of his work shirts. "I want to," she replied, not looking up from her careful stitches. I need to feel useful. He understood. After years of being told she was worthless, productivity had become her proof of value. So he let her organize his bachelor's chaos, watched her transform his rough cabin into something that felt like a home again. She had gentle hands and an eye for detail. His shirts came back from her needle straighter than they'd ever been. His shelves suddenly held books arranged by subject rather than scattered at random. Clara moved through the cabin like a woman relearning how to inhabit space without fear. The first few days, she would flinch when Jed approached too quickly or spoke too loudly. But gradually, as he proved himself safe through consistent gentleness, she began to relax. Her shoulders lost their permanent hunch. Her eyes started meeting his more often. On the fourth day, she discovered his small collection of books, mostly practical volumes on trapping and weather, but also a worn copy of Shakespeare and a volume of Wordsworth's poetry that had belonged to Martha. "You read," she said, running her fingers along the spines with something approaching reverence. "Martha taught me," Jed admitted. "I could manage my letters well enough, but she opened up the world of books for me. Said a man should know about more than just beaver pelts and winter storms." Clara pulled the Shakespeare from the shelf and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but well preserved, marked here and there with Martha's neat handwriting. She had beautiful penmanship. She was a teacher before we married. Came west with her family when she was 19, taught school in Pine Ridge for 3 years, before I worked up the courage to court her. That evening, Clara read aloud by the firelight, while Jed worked on repairing a beaver trap. Her voice was rich and cultured, bringing the words to life in a way that reminded him of Martha, but was distinctly her own. When she read Portia's speech about mercy, her voice caught on the words about the quality of mercy being twice blessed, and Jed understood that she was learning to show mercy to herself. The work of mountain living suited her better than either of them had expected. She learned to split kindling without fear of the axe, to bank fires so they would burn steadily through the night, to read the sky for signs of changing weather. Her hands, soft from years of Boston privilege, developed calluses and strength. "I was a teacher too before I married," she told him one evening as they shared supper, "just for 2 years, at a girls' academy in Boston. I loved helping young minds discover literature and history, watching them grow confident in their abilities." "What stopped you?" "Cornelius said it was unseemly for his wife to work. He wanted me available for social obligations, entertaining his business associates, being the perfect ornament for his success." Her voice carried old bitterness. "I gave it up to please him. I regret that now, giving up something that brought me joy for the sake of someone else's pride." Jed carved a piece of his evening apple and offered it to her on the knife tip. "Maybe you'll teach again someday. Pine Ridge could use a proper school. Most of the children can barely cipher, and their reading stops at Bible verses." Her eyes lit with interest. "Do you think they'd accept me, a woman with my history?" "I think they'd be grateful for someone who cares about their children's futures," Jed said firmly. "The rest is just gossip, and gossip dies when folks have better things to think about." On the 7th day, Jed was working in his small workshop behind the cabin, carving a replacement handle for a broken trap, when he heard Clara scream. He dropped his tools and ran toward the sound, his heart hammering with the fear that her past had somehow caught up with them. He found her pressed against the cabin wall, staring at a large mountain lion that had wandered into their clearing. The cat was magnificent golden fur, rippled with muscle, yellow eyes fixed on Clara with predatory interest. It was thin, probably driven down from higher elevations by early snow, looking for easy prey. "Don't move," Jed said quietly, reaching slowly for the rifle he kept by the door. "Don't run. Don't make sudden movements." But Clara was already frozen with terror, her face pale as winter frost. The mountain lion took a step toward her, its tail twitching with interest. Jed raised the rifle, but the angle was wrong. Clara was too close to the cat for a safe shot. Instead, he did something that went against every survival instinct he'd learned in 30 years of mountain living. He stepped between them. "Hey now," he said to the cat, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want her. Look at me, I'm bigger, more meat on these old bones." The mountain lion's attention shifted to Jed, its ears flattening as it assessed this new threat. For a moment that stretched like eternity, man and beast stared at each other. Then Jed slowly raised his arms above his head, making himself appear larger, and let loose with a roar that echoed off the surrounding peaks. The cat hesitated, then turned and melted back into the forest with the fluid grace of its kind. Jed lowered the rifle and turned to find Clara collapsed against the cabin wall, shaking not with fear, but with something deeper gratitude, so profound it bordered on worship. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "So could you. But you stepped in front of it. For me." Jed set the rifle aside and approached her carefully, as he might approach any frightened creature. "Clara, I've seen what men can do to each other when they set their minds to it. A mountain lion is just following its nature. It kills to eat, not for pleasure. In some ways, that makes it more honorable than most humans I've known." She looked at him with wonder, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "No one has ever protected me before, not once, in all my life." "Well," Jed said, offering her his steadiest smile, "you're in the mountains now. We take care of our own up here." That night, Clara asked if she could sit closer to the fire, and when Jed moved to give her more room, she shook her head. "I meant closer to you." They sat side by side on the old wooden bench Jed had built for Martha, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the mountain. Clara's shoulder touched his, and neither of them moved away. Before retiring, Jed went to his workshop and selected a piece of pine he'd been saving for something special. Working by lamplight, he began carving, his knife moving with the practiced precision of years. By morning, he had finished a small wooden bear, no bigger than a child's hand, its expression gentle and protective. He left it on the kitchen table beside Clara's coffee cup, along with a simple note, "For courage, when the world seems fierce, J." When Clara found it, she held the little bear to her heart, and wept not from sorrow this time, but from the overwhelming recognition of a gift given without expectation of return. The carved wooden bear became Clara's constant companion, tucked in her apron pocket during the day and placed on the nightstand beside her bed each evening. She would touch it when uncertainty crept in, drawing strength from its solid presence and the kindness it represented. Jed pretended not to notice this ritual, but Clara caught him watching her with quiet satisfaction, pleased that his gift had found its purpose. As October deepened into November, their conversations grew longer and more personal. The work of preparing for winter gave them natural reasons to spend time together splitting wood, preserving the last vegetables from Jed's small garden, checking and rechecking the cabin's chinkling against the coming cold. But it was during the quiet evening hours that they truly began to know each other. "We should discuss our arrangement," Clara said one night as they shared coffee after supper. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. "What people might expect of us, legally speaking." Jed set down his cup and regarded her thoughtfully. "You mean marriage?" "I mean protection," Clara replied firmly. "If Cornelia sends men looking for me, they'll have no legal right to take me if I'm properly married to another man. Territorial law recognizes a woman's right to choose her husband, even if Eastern law might say otherwise." The practical nature of her proposal didn't diminish its significance. They both understood what she was asking, not for love, not yet, but for the legal shelter that would keep her safe. "I'd be honored," Jed said simply. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now, if you're willing. Father McKenna could perform the ceremony whenever we can get to town." They shook hands on it, a gesture both formal and oddly intimate. Clara's palm was callous now from mountain work, but her grip was steady and sure. The next day brought the first real snowfall of the season, heavy flakes that fell steadily from a grey sky and transformed the world into something magical. Clara stood at the window, watching the pine boughs bend under their white burden, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, simple joy in the beauty of the moment. "It's magnificent," she breathed, her breath fogging the glass. Jed joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Wait until you see it in moonlight," he said. "Martha used to say it looked like God had scattered diamonds across the mountains." Clara turned to study his profile. "You loved her very much." "I did. She was the light of my world for the short time I had her." "Are you sure you want to marry again, even for practical reasons?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow continue to fall. "Martha and I had something precious, but it's gone now. Has been for 10 years. That doesn't mean my heart died with her, just that it learned to hold different kinds of love." Clara felt her pulse quicken at his words, but before she could respond, Jed continued. "What we have is different from what Martha and I shared, but it's real, and it's growing stronger every day. If that becomes something deeper in time, well, I'd welcome that. If it stays as friendship and partnership, that's enough too." That afternoon, the snow stopped, leaving the world hushed and pristine. Jed suggested they take his horse, Solomon, and ride to Pine Ridge to speak with Father McKenna about the marriage ceremony. The journey took twice as long as usual through the snow-covered trails, but Clara seemed to revel in every moment of it. She had never learned to ride properly. Cornelius had considered it undignified for a woman of her station so. She sat behind Jed on Solomon's broad back, her arms around his waist for balance. The arrangement was intimate but comfortable, and Jed found himself hyper-aware of her presence, the way she relaxed against him as they rode, the soft sound of her laughter when Solomon shied at a snow-laden branch. Pine Ridge looked like a Christmas illustration under its blanket of snow. Smoke rose from chimneys, and warm lamplight glowed in windows as the short afternoon faded toward evening. Several townspeople recognized Jed and nodded politely to Clara, though she noticed how their eyes lingered on her with curiosity. Father McKenna received them in the small room behind the church that served as his study. He was a compact man with intelligent eyes and hands stained with ink from his correspondence with the diocese in Helena. "So you want to marry," he said after they'd explained their situation. He didn't ask about the unusual circumstances of their meeting frontier. Life had taught him that people's pasts were often complicated. "Have you considered the responsibilities that come with the sacrament? We understand this isn't a conventional courtship, Father," Clara said carefully, "but we respect each other, and we're committed to building a life together based on honesty and mutual care." Father McKenna nodded approvingly. "I've seen marriages built on less substantial foundations. When would you like the ceremony?" "As soon as possible," Jed replied, "before the winter storms make travel difficult." "Next Sunday, then, after morning mass. I'll need witnesses perhaps the Baxters could serve. They're good people, and Mrs. Baxter has been saying the town needs more women with education and refinement." As they prepared to leave, Father McKenna drew Clara aside. "My dear, I hope you won't take this amiss, but I've heard whispers about your arrival. People are curious, naturally." Clara stiffened slightly. "What kind of whispers?" "Nothing malicious, just wondering. You arrived under unusual circumstances, and folks are naturally protective of Jed. He's well respected here." I understand their concern, Clara replied with dignity. I hope to prove myself worthy of their friendship in time. I believe you will, the priest said warmly. And I believe you and Jed will find happiness together, whatever brought you to this point. The ride home was quieter, both of them absorbed in contemplation of what they'd committed to. As they crested the final hill and saw Jed's cabin below them, lamplight glowing welcomely in the windows, Clara tightened her arms around his waist. Jed? Yes? Thank you. For everything. For taking me in when no one else would. For treating me like a person worthy of respect. For offering me protection without asking for anything in return. Clara, you've brought life back to this old cabin. You've reminded me what it means to care for someone again. If anyone should be grateful, it's me. That night, as they sat by the fire reading, Clara working through a volume of Emerson while Jed studied his trapping records, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking," he said slowly, "that when I sent for a mail-order bride, I expected someone who would cook my meals and mend my clothes. I never expected to find a partner who would challenge my mind and touch my heart." Clara closed her book and moved to sit beside him on the bench. For the first time since her arrival, she reached out and took his hand in hers. His skin was rough from years of outdoor work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Neither did I," she admitted. "I thought I was broken beyond repair, but you've shown me that some wounds can heal when they're treated with kindness instead of contempt." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, but inside the cabin, two lonely souls had found something they'd stopped believing existed. The possibility of love grown from respect, trust, and the quiet recognition of shared humanity. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every breath feel like a blessing. Clara woke before sunrise, as had become her habit, but instead of immediately rising to tend the fire, she lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of Jed moving quietly through the cabin's main room. Today she would become Mrs. Jedediah Holt, not just in name but in the eyes of God and the law. She had only one dress suitable for the occasion, deep blue wool that she'd packed in her hasty flight from Boston. It was wrinkled from travel and simple compared to the elaborate gown she'd worn for her first wedding, but when she looked at herself in Jed's small mirror, she saw something that had been missing from that earlier ceremony, genuine happiness in her own eyes. Jed had spent the previous evening carefully folding a hand-drawn map of his trapping territory, marking the locations of his most productive beaver dams and the seasonal patterns of game movement. It was his most valuable possession after the cabin itself, representing 30 years of accumulated knowledge about surviving in the mountains. This morning, he tucked it into his best coat pocket, not for any practical reason, but because it represented his intention to share everything he had with the woman who would become his wife. "You look beautiful," he said simply when Clara emerged from the bedroom, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush like a girl. The ride to Pine Ridge took on a ceremonial quality, with Solomon stepping carefully through the snow-packed trail and both riders dressed in their finest clothes. Clara had pinned her hair up with special care, and Jed had trimmed his beard and oiled his boots until they gleamed. They looked, Clara thought with satisfaction, like people who took their promises seriously. Father McKenna had decorated the small church with pine boughs and winter berries, and a surprising number of townspeople had gathered to witness the ceremony. Mrs. Henley had brought her best apple cake, and old Henrik Barton had closed his store for the afternoon. Even Murphy from the Silver Dollar had put on a clean shirt for the occasion. The ceremony itself was simple but moving. Father McKenna spoke about the sacred nature of marriage as a partnership between equals, about the importance of mutual respect and support through life's challenges. When he asked Jed if he would love, honor, and protect Clara, Jed's "I will" rang clear and strong through the small church. Clara's response came with tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone was publicly promising to cherish her, to stand beside her against whatever troubles might come. The moment when Jed slipped a simple gold band onto her finger felt like the sealing of something that had been growing between them for weeks. The ring was new, crafted by the town's blacksmith from gold. Jed had panned from the mountain streams, but it carried the weight of genuine commitment. After the ceremony, the townspeople gathered at Barton's store for an impromptu reception. Clara found herself surrounded by women, eager to welcome her into their community, and she was touched by their genuine warmth. Mrs. Henley immediately began discussing plans for a ladies' auxiliary to help with the church, and the schoolteacher, Miss Peterson, expressed hope that Clara might assist with some of the older children who were struggling with their letters. "We heard you were educated back east," Mrs. Baxter said with obvious approval. "Pine Ridge could use more refined influences." As the afternoon wore on, Clara began to feel something she hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of belonging to a community that valued her for herself rather than her usefulness to someone else. These people didn't know about her past, didn't judge her for the circumstances of her arrival. They simply accepted her as Jed's wife and welcomed her accordingly. The ride home was quiet but comfortable, both of them wrapped in the warm afterglow of the day's events. As they approached the cabin, Clara noticed fresh tracks in the snowboot prints that were neither hers nor Jed's. "Someone's been here," Jed said, his voice immediately alert and cautious. They found evidence of a thorough search. Nothing had been stolen, but drawers had been opened, papers examined, personal belongings disturbed with the systematic care of someone looking for specific information. Clara's few possessions had been particularly scrutinized, her small bag of clothes turned inside out. "They were looking for me," Clara said, her voice tight with fear. "Cornelius has found me." Jed examined the tracks more carefully, noting the quality of the boots and the purposeful nature of the search. "Professional men," he concluded, "detectives or hired investigators. They knew what they were looking for." Clara sank into a chair, the joy of the day dissolving into familiar terror. "He'll never stop hunting me. Never. No matter how far I run, no matter what name I take, he'll keep sending people until he finds me." But Jed's reaction surprised her. Instead of fear or anger, his expression grew thoughtful and determined. He walked to the mantelpiece and retrieved the trapping map from his coat pocket, spreading it carefully on the table. "Then we stop running," he said calmly. "This is our home, Clara, our territory, and I know every inch of it better than any city detective ever could." He pointed to various markings on the map. "There are only 3 trails that lead to this cabin, and 2 of them are impassable once the heavy snows come. Anyone trying to reach us will have to use the main trail, which means they'll pass through a dozen places where a man with a rifle could make their lives very difficult." Clara stared at him. "You're talking about fighting them." "I'm talking about protecting what's mine," Jed replied firmly. "You're my wife now, Clara. That means something up here. It means I'll stand between you and anyone who tries to hurt you, no matter who they are or what legal papers they might carry." That night, as they settled into their new arrangement as husband and wife, Clara lay in the bed they now shared and listened to Jed's steady breathing beside her. The physical intimacy was still new and tentative. They had kissed gently after the ceremony, held hands during the evening, but both understood that deeper intimacy would come in its own time. What struck her most profoundly was the simple fact of not being alone. For the first time in years, she fell asleep, knowing that someone was watching over her, someone who had publicly committed to standing by her side. But even as she drifted towards sleep, she couldn't shake the image of those boot prints in the snow, evidence that her past was still hunting her across the vast distances of the American frontier. In his sleep, Jed's hand found hers under the quilts, and Clara held on tight, drawing strength from his solid presence. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges it would bring, but tonight she was no longer the rejected woman with a bag over her head. Tonight she was Clara Holt, and she had found something worth fighting for. December brought the deep snows that would isolate them from Pine Ridge until spring's thaw. The cabin became their entire world, warm and intimate while the wind howled through the mountain passes and piled snow against their walls. Clara had never experienced such complete seclusion, but rather than feeling trapped, she found herself treasuring these quiet months of discovery. Their marriage deepened gradually, like ice forming on a still pond. They learned each other's habits and preferences, the small rituals that made domestic life flow smoothly. Jed discovered that Clara hummed while she worked, old hymns from her childhood mixed with popular songs she'd heard at Boston social gatherings. Clara learned that Jed talked to himself while doing repairs, carrying on detailed conversations with stubborn hinges and warped boards, as if they were old friends requiring patient coaxing. On Christmas Eve, Jed surprised her by producing a leather-bound family Bible that had belonged to his grandmother. The pages were yellowed with age, and pressed between them were dried flowers from Martha's garden, their colors faded, but their shapes still recognizable. "This has the record of all the Holts who came before," he said, opening to the family register. "Births, deaths, marriages. I thought you might want to add your name here, make it official in the family book." Clara traced the careful handwriting that recorded decades of Holt family history. She saw Jed's birth recorded in his father's precise script, his marriage to Martha noted in different ink, and the heartbreaking entry for Martha's death and the unnamed child who had died with her. "I'd be honored," she whispered, taking the pen he offered. Her handwriting looked different from the masculine script that filled most of the pages, more educated and refined, but it belonged there now. "Clara Blackwood Holt," she wrote, "married to Jedediah Holt on November 28th, 1885, Pine Ridge, Montana Territory." "There," Jed said with satisfaction, "now you're part of the Mountain family." That night, for the first time, their physical intimacy moved beyond gentle kisses and careful touches. It began with Clara falling asleep against Jed's shoulder as he read aloud from Wordsworth, and when she woke hours later to find herself still in his arms, she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her face up to his, and what she saw in his eyes was patient desire tempered with deep affection. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a stark contrast to the brutal encounters she had endured with Cornelius. Jed's hands were gentle, his kisses sweet, and when she tensed with old fears, he simply held her until she relaxed again. He made no demands, took nothing that wasn't freely given, and afterward, as she lay against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, Clara felt something she had never experienced before: the peaceful satisfaction of intimacy offered and received with love. "I never knew it could be like this," she confessed in the darkness. "What we have is real," Jed replied, stroking her hair. "Built on respect and caring. That makes all the difference." The new year brought fresh challenges and deeper understanding. Clara began sharing more details about her life in Boston, not just the painful parts, but the good memories too. She told Jed about her teaching days, the bright students who had challenged her thinking, the satisfaction of watching young minds grow confident in their abilities. "I keep thinking about what you said about starting a school in Pine Ridge," she said one snowy afternoon as they sat by the fire. "The children there are hungry for learning. I could see it in their eyes at church." "You'd be good at it," Jed agreed. "You have the patience of a born teacher and the knowledge to back it up. But would the parents trust me, a woman with my questionable past?" Jed set down the beaver pelt he was preparing and looked at her seriously. "Clara, you've been Mrs. Jedediah Holt for 2 months now. You've attended church, participated in community gatherings, shown yourself to be a woman of character and education. Whatever whispers might have followed you here are fading. People judge by what they see, and what they see is a lady who's made their respected neighbor happy." As winter deepened, they fell into comfortable routines that felt as natural as breathing. Clara would read aloud while Jed worked on his traps and tools. He taught her to identify animal tracks in the snow, to read weather signs in the behavior of birds and the color of the sky. She helped him with correspondence, writing business letters to fur buyers in Helena with her educated hand, keeping careful records of his inventory and accounts. One evening in late January, as a blizzard raged outside their snug cabin, Clara made a confession that had been weighing on her heart. "Jed, there's something I need to tell you about why I can never have children." He looked up from the harness he was mending, his expression attentive but not anxious. "When I was married to Cornelius, I became pregnant twice," she continued, her voice steady but sad. "Both times, I miscarried. The doctor said it was due to the stress and fear I lived with daily. After the second loss, Cornelius said I was defective, that I'd failed in my most basic duty as a wife." Jed set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on their bench. "Clara, you know that's not true." "Part of me does know that now," she admitted, "but part of me still fears that I'll disappoint you the same way. You lost a child with Martha, and here you are married to a woman who may never be able to give you the family you wanted." Jed took her hands in his, weathered fingers intertwining with hers. "When I married Martha, we dreamed of having children because we were young and thought that's what completed a family. But I've learned something in the years since then. Family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people you choose to love and care for." He gestured toward the Bible on the mantelpiece. "That book records 4 generations of Holts, but it doesn't tell the whole story. My great-uncle Samuel never had children of his own, but he raised 6 orphaned nieces and nephews after their parents died in a fire. My grandfather's sister couldn't bear children, but she midwifed half the babies in their county and was called grandmother by dozens of children who weren't blood relatives." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You're saying family comes in different forms." "I'm saying that you and I are already a family," Jed replied firmly. "If children come to us somehow, whether through birth or other means, we'll welcome them. If they don't, we'll pour our love into each other and into the community around us. Either way, we'll have lived fully and loved completely." That night, as they lay together in the warmth of their shared bed, Clara felt the last of her old shame finally release its hold on her heart. She was not defective or broken. She was a woman who had survived terrible circumstances and found her way to love and acceptance. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside their cabin, 2 hearts beat in peaceful rhythm, no longer lonely, no longer afraid. March arrived with the first tentative hints of spring icicles dripping from the eaves during the warmest part of the day, patches of bare ground appearing where the snow had begun to recede. Clara stood at the window, watching for the first wildflowers that Jed had promised would soon dot the meadow below their cabin. When she saw them, 3 riders approaching slowly up the mountain trail. Even from a distance, she could tell these were not local men. They sat their horses with the rigid posture of those accustomed to city streets rather than mountain paths, and their clothing was too fine for frontier travel. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. "Jed," she called, her voice carefully controlled but urgent. He appeared at her shoulder, following her gaze to the approaching riders. His expression hardened as he took in their purposeful advance. "Get the rifle," he said quietly, "and stay away from the windows." Clara retrieved the Winchester from its place above the fireplace, her hands shaking only slightly as she checked to ensure it was loaded. Jed positioned himself near the door, his own rifle ready, but not openly threatening. The lead rider was a tall man with iron-grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He dismounted with practiced ease and approached the cabin alone, leaving his companions by their horses. "Mr. Holt," he called out, "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal James Crawford. I'd like to speak with you and your wife about a legal matter." Jed opened the door but remained in the threshold, his rifle visible but not raised. "Marshal, what brings federal law to my mountain?" Crawford's eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Jed's defensive posture and the glimpse of Clara behind him. "I'm here about Mrs. Clara Blackwood. She's wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of $10,000 from her lawful husband in Boston." "Mrs. Clara Holt," Jed corrected firmly, "and she's standing right here if you want to ask her questions." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Holt now, is it? Well, that complicates matters legally, but it doesn't change the fact that Mr. Cornelius Blackwood has sworn out a warrant for her arrest." Clara stepped forward, her chin raised with dignity despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Marshal Crawford, I assume Mr. Blackwood showed you substantial evidence to justify such serious charges." "He did indeed, ma'am. Bank records showing the withdrawal of $10,000 from his business account, signed in your hand. A sworn statement from his business partner confirming that you took the money without permission, and testimony from household staff that you fled in the night like a common thief." Clara felt the familiar weight of Cornelius's manipulation, the way he could twist truth into lies, so convincing that even she sometimes doubted her own memories. But months of Jed's steady support had given her strength she hadn't possessed in Boston. "Marshal, did Mr. Blackwood also show you my father's will, which specifically left that money to me alone? Did he mention that under Massachusetts law, a woman's inheritance remains her separate property unless she voluntarily signs it over to her husband?" Crawford's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of uncertainty creeping into his official demeanor. He mentioned an inheritance dispute, but said the money had been legally transferred to his control upon your marriage. "That's a lie," Clara said flatly. "The money was mine by right, held in my name at the Boston Merchants Bank. I took what belonged to me when I fled an abusive situation." One of the other riders, a man with the hard eyes of a hired gun, spoke up impatiently. "Enough talk, Marshal. We've got our orders and our warrant. Bring her back and let the court sort out her story." But Crawford raised a hand for silence, his attention focused on Clara. "Ma'am, these are serious accusations. If you're innocent, why didn't you stay and fight the charges legally?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "Because Mr. Blackwood owns half the judges in Boston, Marshal. Because a woman's word against her husband's is worth nothing in most courtrooms. Because I had marks on my wrists from the ropes he used to tie me to our bed, and when I showed them to the first lawyer I consulted, he suggested I must have done something to deserve such treatment." Jed stepped closer to his wife, his presence a solid wall of support. "Marshal, you seem like a fair man. Look at her. Does she strike you as a criminal?" Crawford studied Clara carefully, taking in her calm demeanor, her educated speech, the way she stood with dignity despite the circumstances. "No," he admitted slowly, "she doesn't. But I have a legal warrant, and Mr. Blackwood has influential friends in Washington. This needs to be resolved through proper channels." "What if I could prove my legal right to that money?" Clara asked suddenly. "What if I had documentation showing it was my inheritance, never legally transferred to my husband?" The marshal's interest sharpened. "Do you have such documentation?" Clara hesitated, then looked at Jed. He nodded encouragingly, understanding passing between them. "I hid the papers before I left Boston," she said. "My father's will, the bank documents establishing the inheritance account, a letter from the bank president confirming my separate ownership. They're in a safe deposit box in Denver, held under my maiden name." Crawford considered this information carefully. Behind him, the hired guns shifted restlessly, clearly unhappy with the direction the conversation was taking. "Denver's a long way from here," the marshal said finally, "and winter travel is dangerous. But if such documents exist and support your claim, it would certainly change the legal situation." "Marshal," the hard-eyed man interrupted, "we weren't hired to conduct an investigation. We were hired to bring back a thief." Crawford's expression hardened as he turned to face the speaker. "You were hired to assist a federal marshal in the execution of a warrant, nothing more. I'll conduct this investigation as I see fit." Clara saw her opportunity. "Marshal Crawford, I propose this. Give me until the spring thaw is complete, and I'll travel to Denver with you personally to retrieve those documents. If they don't prove my innocence, I'll submit to arrest without resistance. But if they do prove my legal right to that money, the charges should be dropped and my husband prosecuted for filing false accusations." The marshal was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Clara could see him struggling between his official duty and his growing suspicion that he was being used in a domestic dispute rather than pursuing a genuine criminal. "That's a reasonable proposal," he said finally, "but I'll need some guarantee that you won't disappear before then." "She'll be here," Jed said firmly. "This is our home, and we're not running anymore." Crawford nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll return in 6 weeks. When the mountain passes are clear, we'll make the journey to Denver together and let the evidence speak for itself." After the men rode away, Clara collapsed into Jed's arms, her composure finally cracking. "What if the papers aren't enough?" she whispered. "What if Cornelius has found a way to discredit them too?" "Then we'll face that when it comes," Jed replied, holding her close. "But Clara, you stood up to them today. You didn't cower or beg or accept their version of events. You demanded justice based on truth and that Marshall heard you." That night, as they lay in bed discussing their options, Clara made a decision that surprised them both. "I want you to come with me to Denver," she said, "not just for support, but as my legal representative. As my husband, you have the right to speak for me in legal matters." Jed was quiet for a moment. "That's a long journey, and it could be dangerous if Blackwood has more men waiting." "I know, but I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting him control my life from 1,000 miles away. It's time to end this, once and for all." Outside their window, the mountain wind sang through the pines, carrying the promise of spring and the hope of freedom. In 6 weeks, Clara would face her past and fight for her future, but she would not face it alone. The wanted poster that Marshal Crawford had left behind lay on their kitchen table, bearing Clara's name and description alongside the damning words "theft" and "reward." But beside it sat the family Bible, open to the page where Clara's name was recorded as a Holt. And somehow that seemed more real and true than any legal document Cornelius Blackwood could produce. The 6 weeks that followed Marshal Crawford's visit passed with agonizing slowness, each day measured against the approaching confrontation that would determine Clara's fate. Spring advanced reluctantly in the high country, snow melting in fits and starts, revealing patches of brown earth that gradually gave way to the first tender shoots of new grass. Clara threw herself into preparations with the methodical intensity of a general planning a campaign. She spent hours each day reviewing every detail of her father's will, memorizing dates and legal language that might prove crucial in Denver. More importantly, she began writing long, detailed accounts of her marriage to Cornelius, documenting every instance of abuse, every legal manipulation, every attempt to control her inheritance. "If I'm going to face this," she told Jed one evening as she bent over her writing by lamplight, "I want there to be a complete record, not just for the legal proceedings, but for myself. I need to see it all written down, to understand how I survived, what I survived." Jed watched her work with mixture of admiration and concern. The approaching confrontation was transforming Clara, burning away the last vestiges of the frightened woman who had arrived with a sack over her head. In her place was emerging someone stronger, tempered by adversity, but not broken by it. The community of Pine Ridge rallied around them in ways that surprised both Clara and Jed. Word of the legal troubles had spread, as news inevitably did in small towns. But rather than judgment, they found support. Mrs. Henley brought preserves and encouragement. Father McKenna offered prayers and practical advice about dealing with corrupt officials. Even Murphy from the Silver Dollar, not known for sentimentality, stopped by to assure Jed that real men protect their women, and anyone who says different can answer to me. Most significantly, old Henrik Barton surprised them both by revealing that he had once been a lawyer in St. Louis before coming west to seek his fortune in gold that never materialized. "I may be rusty," he admitted, spreading Clara's documents across his store counter for examination. "But I remember enough about inheritance law to know that your father structured this very carefully. See here." He pointed to a specific clause in the will. "He explicitly states that this money is to remain separate from any marital property, not subject to coverture laws." That's unusual language for the time, which means he knew exactly what he was doing. Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward her long-dead father, understanding for the first time that his careful legal provisions had been motivated by concern for her welfare rather than mere legal precision. "The question," Barton continued, "is whether you can prove that the money in question came from this inheritance account rather than from your husband's business funds." "I can," Clara said confidently. "The bank records will show the transfer from the estate account to my personal account, and then the withdrawal I made before leaving Boston. The dates and amounts will match exactly." Barton nodded approvingly. "Good, but be prepared for Blackwood to claim that you forged those records, or that you manipulated your father into changing his will. Rich men don't give up $10,000 without a fight." As the departure date approached, Clara found herself experiencing an unexpected sense of liberation. For months, she had lived with the constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that her past was hunting her across the vast distances of the frontier. Now, instead of hiding, she was choosing to face that past directly, armed with truth and supported by people who valued her for who she had become, rather than what she had fled from. The night before Marshal Crawford's expected return, Clara and Jed sat together on their porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The air was warm enough now that they could sit outside without coats, and the first wildflowers had begun to bloom in the meadow below their cabin. "Are you afraid?" Jed asked, his hand finding hers in the gathering twilight. "Terrified," Clara admitted honestly, but not the same kind of fear I used to live with. This isn't the helpless terror of a trapped animal. This is the fear that comes before a fight you're determined to win. And if we lose, if the legal system sides with Blackwood despite the evidence. Clara was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities they had both avoided discussing directly. Then we'll face whatever comes next together. But Jed, I need you to understand something. I will never go back to being his property. Whatever the cost, I will never again allow myself to be treated as less than human. Jed squeezed her hand, understanding the steel beneath her quiet words. It won't come to that. Truth has a power all its own, and your truth is stronger than his lies. Marshal Crawford arrived the next morning with the same two companions, but his demeanor had subtly shifted. The rigid officiousness was still there, but Clara sensed something else, Lawman's instinct that the case he'd been asked to pursue might not be as straightforward as originally presented. "Mrs. Holt," he said formally, "are you prepared to travel to Denver to resolve this matter?" "I am, Marshal. My husband will be accompanying us." Crawford nodded, unsurprised. "I expected as much. The journey will take 4 days each way, weather permitting. I trust you understand the seriousness of what we're undertaking." "I understand perfectly," Clara replied. "I'm staking my freedom on my ability to prove my innocence. I wouldn't make such a wager lightly." The hard-eyed gunman who had accompanied Crawford looked dissatisfied with the proceedings. "This is a waste of time, Marshal. The warrant is clear. Bring back the woman for trial." "The warrant," Crawford replied coldly, "authorizes me to investigate and apprehend if warranted. I intend to investigate thoroughly before making any arrests." As they prepared to leave, Clara took a moment to look back at the cabin that had become her sanctuary. The home she and Jed had built together seemed small and vulnerable against the vast backdrop of mountains and sky, but it represented something precious, the possibility of a life lived with dignity and love. "Ready?" Jed asked, helping her up onto Solomon's back. They would ride double to Denver, as they had on their wedding day, drawing strength from physical closeness during the ordeal ahead. "Ready," Clara confirmed, settling against Jed's solid warmth as they began their descent toward the main trail. The journey to Denver took them through country. Clara had never seen rolling plains that stretched to the horizon, small settlements struggling to establish themselves in the vastness of the territory, and finally the growing bustle of Colorado's capital city. With each mile, Clara felt herself transforming from the mountain woman she had become back into something resembling her Boston self, drawing on reserves of education and social sophistication that had lain dormant during her months in the wilderness. Denver, in 1886, was a city caught between its rough frontier origins and its ambitions for respectability. Elegant new buildings stood alongside ramshackle structures left over from the gold rush days, and the streets teemed with an intriguing mixture of cowboys, businessmen, miners, and society ladies. Marshal Crawford had arranged rooms at the Windsor Hotel, Denver's finest establishment, and Clara couldn't help but appreciate the irony of staying in luxury while fighting for her freedom from a man who had used wealth as a weapon against her. "Tomorrow morning," Crawford informed them over dinner, "we'll visit the Denver National Bank, where you claim to have hidden these documents. I've already sent word ahead they're expecting us." That night, as Clara lay beside Jed in their hotel room, she felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. In a few hours, she would either prove her innocence and win her freedom, or face arrest and the prospect of being dragged back to Boston in chains. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered to Jed in the darkness, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back my sense of worth when I thought I had lost it forever." "Clara," Jed replied, pulling her close. "Tomorrow isn't an ending, it's a beginning. When we walk out of that bank, we're going to have proof of your innocence, and then we're going home to build the life we both deserve." Outside their window, Denver settled into sleep, unaware that in the morning, a woman's fate would be decided by the truth she had been brave enough to preserve and the love that had given her strength to fight for it. The inheritance documents that would vindicate her lay waiting in a bank vault across the city, but Clara no longer felt like a victim awaiting judgment. She felt like a woman who had found her voice and learned to use it in defense of justice and truth. The Denver National Bank stood like a fortress of respectability on Larimer Street, its stone facade radiating the kind of institutional authority that had once intimidated Clara, but now seemed merely another obstacle to overcome. She walked through its brass-fitted doors with her head high, flanked by Jed on one side and Marshall Crawford on the other, while the two hired guns followed at a respectful distance. The bank president, Mr. Augustus Fleming, was a portly man with magnificent whiskers who clearly took his responsibilities seriously. He had prepared for their visit by assembling not only the requested safe deposit box contents, but also several witnesses to attest to the authenticity of whatever they might find. "Mrs. Holt," he said with formal courtesy, "or should I say, Mrs. Blackwood, I confess the situation is somewhat unusual." "Mrs. Holt will do," Clara replied firmly. "The safe deposit box was rented under my maiden name, Clara Pemberton, in September of last year." Fleming consulted his ledger book with the careful precision of a man accustomed to dealing with large sums of money. "Yes, here it is. Box number 47, rented by Miss Clara Pemberton on September 15th, 1885. The rental was paid for 1 full year in advance." Marshall Crawford stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the morning light, streaming through the bank's tall windows. "Mr. Fleming, I need you to understand that the contents of this box may constitute evidence in a federal investigation. Everything must be properly witnessed and documented." "Of course, Marshal. I've arranged for our head clerk and our legal counsel to be present as impartial witnesses." They were led to a private room where the safe deposit box waited on a mahogany table. Clara's hands trembled only slightly as she withdrew the small key from her reticulite key she had guarded so carefully during her flight from Boston, sleeping with it pinned inside her chemise, never letting it out of her possession. "Before we open this," Marshall Crawford said, "I want everyone present to understand what we're looking for. Mrs. Holt Blackwood claims that the $10,000 she withdrew from a Boston bank was her legitimate inheritance, not money stolen from her husband. The contents of this box should either support or refute that claim." Clara inserted the key and turned it with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. Inside the narrow metal box were several carefully folded documents, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. Her father's lawyer had taught her that precaution-important papers needed protection from the elements of time and chance. The first document she withdrew was her father's last will and testament, signed and witnessed according to Massachusetts law. Marshall Crawford examined it carefully, his trained eye noting the official seals and legal language. "This appears genuine," he said slowly, "and it clearly states that the sum of $3,000 from the estate of Reverend Jonathan Pemberton is to be held in trust for his daughter Clara, separate from any marital property." "3,000, one of the hired gunmen interjected. "Blackwood claimed she stole 10,000. Clara smiled grimly as she withdrew the next document, This is the bank statement showing the growth of that inheritance through careful investment over the years since my father's death. The Boston Merchants Bank managed the account conservatively but profitably. The bank statement, bearing the official letterhead and seal of the Boston institution, showed a series of entries documenting the growth of Clara's inheritance from the original $3,000 to a final balance of $10,247.83 as of her withdrawal date. Mr. Fleming examined the document with professional interest. These appear to be authentic bank records. The paper stock, the printing, the official seals all consistent with major Eastern banking institutions. But it was the third document that provided the most damning evidence against Cornelius Blackwood's claims. Clara unfolded a letter from the president of Boston Merchants Bank, dated just 1 week before her flight from the city. Marshall Crawford read aloud, "Dear Mrs. Blackwood, this letter confirms that the account held in your name as beneficiary of the Pemberton estate remains your separate property under Massachusetts inheritance law. Your husband's attorney has contacted us requesting access to these funds, but we are legally prohibited from releasing them without your personal authorization, as specified in your father's will." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If the bank had refused to give Cornelius access to the money, then Clara's withdrawal of her own inheritance could hardly constitute theft. "There's more," Clara said quietly, producing a final document. It was a copy of a legal petition filed by Cornelius's attorney, attempting to gain control of her inheritance through the courts, dated 2 days after her escape from Boston. "This proves that Mr. Blackwood knew the money was legally mine," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "He tried to steal it through legal manipulation, and when that failed, he accused me of theft to force my return." Marshall Crawford's expression had grown increasingly grim as he examined each piece of evidence. The case he had been asked to pursue was unraveling before his eyes, revealing not a theft, but an attempted abuse of legal authority. "These documents appear to be authentic and conclusive," he said finally. "Mrs. Holt, based on this evidence, I see no grounds for the charges against you. In fact, I believe there are grounds for charging your former husband with filing false accusations and possibly with attempted fraud." The sheriff's badge on Crawford's vest caught the light as he turned to face the hired gunman, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Clara saw something she had almost stopped believing in: justice served by an honest lawman who valued truth over influence. The hard-eyed gunman who had been so eager to drag Clara back to Boston stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his pistol grip. "Marshal, you may be satisfied with those papers, but Mr. Blackwood is paying us to bring back his wife, documents or no documents." Marshall Crawford's transformation was immediate and complete. The careful, diplomatic lawman vanished, replaced by someone with steel in his spine and ice in his eyes. "Mister, are you threatening to interfere with a federal investigation?" "I'm saying we have a contract," the gunman replied, his voice hardening to match the marshal's. "Blackwood wants his wife back, and he's paying good money to see it happens." "Then Mr. Blackwood is about to lose his money," Crawford said, his hand now hovering near his own weapon, "because this woman is innocent of any crime, and I'll be damned if I'll let hired thugs drag her back to face false charges." The tension in the bank's private room stretched taut as piano wire. Mr. Fleming and his witnesses pressed themselves against the far wall, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Jed moved slightly, positioning himself to shield Clara if violence erupted. But Clara surprised them all by stepping forward, her voice cutting through the dangerous silence with calm authority. "Gentlemen, there's no need for gunplay," she said. Mister, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. The gunman's eyes narrowed. Daniels, Jake Daniels. Mr. Daniels, you were hired to return a thief to face justice, but as Marshal Crawford has established, there was no theft. Your contract was based on false premises, which makes it legally void. Daniels laughed harshly. Lady, I don't care about your legal niceties. I got paid to do a job, and I intend to do it. Even if it means kidnapping an innocent woman? Clara asked. Even if it means defying a federal marshal? How much is Mr. Blackwood paying you, Mr. Daniels? Is it enough to compensate for the years you'll spend in federal prison? For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the gunman's eyes. His companion, who had remained silent until now, spoke up nervously. Jake, maybe we should listen to the marshal. If she's got papers proving her innocence. Shut up, Pete, Daniels snapped. Blackwood warned us she was clever, said she'd try to talk her way out of it. Clara felt a familiar surge of anger at the casual dismissal of her intelligence, the assumption that her words were merely feminine manipulation rather than reasoned argument. But this time, instead of cowering, she let the anger fuel her courage. Mr. Daniels, you're quite right that I am clever. Clever enough to know that Mr. Blackwood sent you here not to serve justice, but to silence me before I could prove his lies. He knew these documents existed. He knew they would exonerate me. That's why he was so desperate to have me dragged back before I could retrieve them. She reached into her reticule and withdrew something that made everyone in the room freeze, her original wedding photograph, the one that had been hidden in her locket. But now the image told a different story than it had months ago. This is my wedding picture, Mr. Daniels. Look at it carefully. Look at my face. Do you see a happy bride, or do you see a woman who's already afraid? Daniels glanced at the photograph despite himself, and Clara saw recognition flicker in his expression, the recognition of a man who had probably seen enough violence to know its signs. My husband has been systematically destroying my reputation, my credibility, my very identity for 15 years, Clara continued. He tied me to our bed when I displeased him. He isolated me from friends and family. He tried to steal my inheritance when his business ventures failed. And when I finally found the courage to escape, he hired men like you to drag me back into his cage. She looked directly at Daniels, her green eyes blazing with righteous fury. But I am not that frightened woman anymore. I have found my voice, my strength, and my proof. So you have a choice, Mr. Daniels. You can try to complete your contract and face federal charges for kidnapping, or you can accept that your employer lied to you and walk away. Marshal Crawford stepped forward, his badge catching the morning light. Mrs. Holt is correct about the legal consequences. Gentlemen, I'm ordering you to stand down. This investigation is concluded, and Mrs. Holt is free to return home with her husband. For a long moment, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then Daniels's companion, Pete, holstered his weapon with obvious relief. Jake, let's go. This ain't worth hanging for. Daniels held Clara's gaze for several more seconds, perhaps seeing in her transformation something that reminded him of his own capacity for change. Finally, he nodded curtly. You're a lucky woman, Mrs. Holt. But if Blackwood comes after you again— If he does, Jed interrupted, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the bank, he'll have to come through me, and I guarantee that won't end well for him. As the hired guns left the bank, their footsteps echoing in the marble lobby, Clara felt the last chains of her old life finally fall away. She walked to the window, and with ceremonial deliberation, tore her wedding photograph in half. The pieces fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves, and with them fell the last vestiges of the frightened woman who had once believed she deserved the pain Cornelius Blackwood had inflicted. Clara Holt was free. Spring had fully claimed the Montana mountains by the time Clara and Jed returned home from Denver. The meadow below their cabin blazed with wild flowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and mountain asters, creating a tapestry of color that seemed to celebrate their victory. Clara stood on their porch, breathing in the thin, clean air that had become as essential to her as water, and felt the profound peace that comes from battles fought and won. Marshal Crawford had been true to his word. Not only had he officially cleared Clara of all charges, but he had also initiated an investigation into Cornelius Blackwood's abuse of the legal system. The last they had heard, the Boston shipping magnate was facing serious questions about his business practices and his treatment of his wife, questions that might finally hold him accountable for years of cruelty. "It's over," Clara said to Jed as they sat together on the bench he had built, watching the sun paint the western peaks in shades of gold and rose. "Really, truly over." "How does it feel?" he asked, his weathered hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of genuine partnership. "Like I can finally breathe," she admitted. "For so many years, I lived with this weight on my chest, this constant fear that I wasn't enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't safe. Now, for the first time since I was a girl, I feel like I belong exactly where I am." The summer that followed was one of purposeful building. Clara threw herself into establishing the school she had dreamed of, working with Father McKenna and the town council to convert an unused building into Pine Ridge's first proper schoolhouse. The community embraced the project with enthusiasm, donating materials, labor, and furniture with the generous spirit that characterized frontier life at its best. On the first day of school, Clara stood before 12 eager children ranging in age from 6 to 14, her heart full of a joy she had thought lost forever. These children would learn to read and write, to cipher and think critically, to see education as a pathway to whatever futures they might choose for themselves. "Learning," she told them that first morning, "is the one thing no one can ever take away from you. Whatever happens in your lives, whatever challenges you face, the knowledge you gain and the strength of your minds will always belong to you alone." Jed expanded his trapping operation, but more importantly, he began teaching other men the sustainable practices that had allowed him to thrive in the mountains for 3 decades. Clara helped him document his methods, creating detailed maps and guides that would preserve his knowledge for future generations of mountain men. In August, a letter arrived from Boston that made Clara laugh with genuine delight. It was from the law firm that had once represented Cornelius, informing her that her former husband had been arrested for fraud in connection with several failed business ventures. The charges carried substantial prison time, and his considerable assets had been frozen pending the outcome of his trial. "Justice," Clara said, showing the letter to Jed. "Real justice, not the kind that money can buy." But it was another letter, arriving in September, that truly marked the transformation of her life. This one bore the official seal of the Massachusetts probate court and contained news that took Clara's breath away. "My father had other investments," she told Jed, her voice shaking with emotion as she read the legal documents. "Property in Boston that I never knew about, stocks and bonds that he held in trust. With Cornelius's assets frozen and his claims against my inheritance invalidated, everything has reverted to me." The amount was staggering, nearly $50,000 in total assets, enough to transform not just their lives, but the entire community of Pine Ridge. "What do you want to do with it?" Jed asked, understanding that this windfall represented far more than money. It represented Clara's complete vindication, her father's final gift of security and independence. Clara was quiet for a long time, watching the early autumn light play across the mountains that had become her sanctuary. Finally, she smiled with the confidence of a woman who had found her true purpose. "I want to build something lasting," she said. "A real school, with a library and proper equipment, a medical clinic for the community, maybe even help other women who are trying to escape situations like mine." That winter, as they planned and dreamed by their fireplace, Clara often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of safety and love. The woman who had arrived with a sack over her head, branded as unfit and unredeemable, had discovered her own worth and fought to claim it. On a snowy evening in December, exactly 1 year after their first intimate night together, Jed presented Clara with a gift that left her speechless. It was a wedding ring, but not store-bought gold. This one had been crafted by his own hands from Montana, gold he had panned from their mountain streams, set with a small but perfect sapphire he had purchased with his fur profits. "I know we're already married," he said as he slipped it onto her finger beside the simple band from their hasty ceremony. "But I wanted you to have something that represents what we've built together. Something made from this land we love, something as enduring as our commitment to each other." Clara held up her hand, watching the sapphire catch the firelight. "It's beautiful, Jed, but more than that, it's ours. Something we created together, like everything else in our life." That night, as they lay together in the warmth of their shared bed, Clara thought about the strange providence that had brought them together. A cruel rejection had become a blessed redemption. A woman discarded as worthless had found her true value, and a lonely mountain man had discovered that love could come twice in a lifetime, different from the first, but no less precious. Outside their window, snow fell softly on the Montana peaks, but inside their cabin, two hearts beat in perfect rhythm, no longer solitary, no longer afraid. They had found each other against all odds, and in finding each other, they had found themselves. The little wooden bear that Jed had carved still sat on Clara's nightstand, a reminder of the courage she had discovered within herself. But now it was joined by other treasures: her father's Bible, with its record of Holt family history, including her own name written in proud script, and the wedding photograph they had taken at their second ceremony, showing two people who had learned that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the words unfit and rejected and end with cherished and home.